Thanks everyone for having me again for this. I'm amazed people came for this one. I was a bit worried because this is really going to be about logistics, and this is going to be about what many people think is a rather dull subject. I personally find it fascinating, and I think it's something that we're going to have to study in more detail going forward to understand it. It's something, as I start this first slide, by the way, you also hear in this war, it's a lot of interesting discussion about sustainment. So people are talking, they're using different words, but which means sort of the same thing. Logistics and sustainment, I would argue, are close to the same thing. And I'm going to start with a famous quote that people say. You'll hear this a lot if you read military history or go to events, and some people will say, well, you know, amateurs discuss tactics and experts discuss logistics. But as I say, then nobody's an expert because nobody writes about logistics. You know, it's actually the military history profession in some way admitting that it's amateurish, because there aren't many books on logistics compared to tactics. There's far more. If you go and look at most bookstores, most of the books are about tactics when it comes to battles, or how they're fought, what the generals do. I'm going to actually tonight try and give a very different picture of how a war and battles are indeed decided. During, I would say, you know, what happens in times of peace, most people tune out on logistics. It becomes the preserve of a small number of military officers. Now, one of the issues is actually, if you make your career in logistics, you're often not going to rise that high. And that's an important thing within the military. That if you're going to rise high in the military, you often need combat commands or some kind of career thing, whereas if you spend your time delivering soap, it's not always something that is going to rise to the top. So the study of logistics becomes often the preserve of mid-ranking officers or civil servants. It's not very flashy for either politicians or leading officers to spend a lot of time on logistics. However, arguably, as I say in the third, within the history of war, you could look and basically say the history of war is the history of logistics, because logistics will decide almost every war. Now, what do I mean by logistics? And that's why I put that statement there, definition, question point. I would say the definition that I have of logistics is a little more holistic than many. There is a common understanding of logistics, that basically logistics is the process to bring the finished good to the battle area constantly. It's sort of the flow from the finished good. So once you build the meals ready to eat, once you build the ammunition, then how you get it to the battlefield is a logistical operation. I think that's only, and you're probably not going to be surprised after the other lectures, I think that's only half of logistics. Logistics actually starts in the pre-production phase. It's the flow of it is basically the flow of the creation of military power. So it starts long before the factory and it goes up until the battle. So logistics is a massive process. They actually had, and I don't want to switch to this phrase now, but in the 19th century they used a very different phrase when they talked about it. They used often the phrase communications, the control of communications. Now we look at communicating as talking. They didn't. Communications just meant the movement of everything, the movement and flow of supplies. So when I'm going to be talking about logistics today, I'm going to be talking a lot more than just deployment, though I will talk about deployment. I'll be talking about the whole creation of a military machine and its deployment. Now, Second World War logistics, I don't think it's even arguable. I could have probably taken the arguable out by just saying that most major campaigns and battles were determined by logistics. It's hard to think of any battle that is not ultimately determined by the flow of supplies. Either one side eventually can get things in and the other side can't, and that makes a massive difference to how things turn out. And what is also apparent when you look at a battle from that perspective, actually what you'll realize is that affecting the flow of logistics makes a much greater difference than what happens on the battlefield. It's far better to look at a battle as a logistical operation as opposed to a tactical one. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit now about a battle I think you've probably all heard about, which is the Battle of Stalingrad. Probably the most famous battle of the Second World War, sort of up there. And this is a map of the Stalingrad area in late 1942 into early 1943, when the battle is at the high point. And there is the town of Stalingrad there. Now, what had happened, I mean, how many people portray the battle is the fighting that goes on here. So you see movies, it's about fighting in the tractor factories. You read books, it's about the soldiers' experiences, and they're absolutely horrible and absolutely brutal on both sides. It's a grotesque sort of meeting of barbarity in Stalingrad, but that's generally told from the point of view of what happens in Stalingrad. Stalingrad is determined entirely logistically by what happens outside the town. So actually what happens in the town is, from late 1942, completely ordained by what is happening logistically outside. Now, the story of the campaign, and I won't go into it in too much detail because I got a lot of ground to cover tonight, is that it begins in the summer of 1942 when Hitler launches his last sort of great summer offensive. I mean, there's the Kursk offensive the year later, but that's more limited. But in the summer of 1942, Hitler is actually trying to win the war on the Eastern Front. So he loads up as much of his army as he can, doesn't have air power as much as he should, but he has a lot of ground forces, and he basically launches them towards the Caucasus and towards Stalingrad. So basically, this is the northern flank of what's a much larger operation heading down into the Caucasus. It is in some ways, in a holistic way, a logistical campaign by Hitler, because what he's trying to do is get oil. The Caucasus are the biggest supply of oil that Russia has. He makes a relatively rational economic case that if he can take the Caucasus, that Russia will be out of oil. And that would have a devastating impact on Russia's ability, the Soviet Union's ability, to prosecute the war. And Germany would then not only have some Romanian oil, it would then have oodles of oil from the Caucasus, so that economically it would be a transformative campaign. So it is a logistical campaign in creation. And actually, the force going to Stalingrad here is not the main force. The force going to Stalingrad, the Sixth Army under General von Paulus, is to provide security to the north of the main offense. So the main offensive is heading down here into the Caucasus, and this army is going to Stalingrad to try and basically provide cover for the strike force into the south. Now, what happens then, though, is Hitler in some ways forgets the logistical purpose, thankfully. All right, so Hitler gets to Stalingrad, thinks he's going to capture the town. It turns out to take a little more effort than he's thinking, and he says, screw it, I want to take the town for political reasons. He forgets logistics and starts thinking about political gain. I want to take the town that's named after Stalin. And it was named after Stalin because Stalin fought there during the Russian Civil War. It was called Tsaritsyn in those days. So he forces and orders basically all German troops to try and take the city, and he screens the outside with not very well supplied and pretty unmotivated Romanians and Italians and Hungarians. All right, so he basically uses the poor troops to protect the flanks and sends the German army right into Stalingrad, the city. You might say he loses absolutely logistical understanding of what's happening. Stalin understands it far more. And Stalin says, great, I'll let the Germans batter their head against the buildings of the city. And what he does then is, you might say it's the first very effective Soviet counterattack of the Second World War. They launch what's called Operation Uranus, which completely bypasses Stalingrad and cuts the supply lines coming out of the city. So it's these attacks here that the Soviet Union does first. And that basically ends the battle. It lasts for another few months, but the German army is stuck there, the Sixth Army. The Red Army controls all the roads in and out of Stalingrad, and then the Sixth Army is basically living on borrowed time. I talked about it. It was Goering makes a false promise that he can supply the Sixth Army by air. He can't do it. He doesn't have the ability to fly the supplies in. So the only way the Germans can get the supplies in is by road. I'm going to be talking about road supply later, but they can't actually get close enough to Stalingrad to reopen the roads. And then after 3 months, the army gives up, or it really in many ways has to cease fighting, because it runs out of supplies. It has no bullets. It has no ability to actually fight. And that is the story of Stalingrad. So what happens in the city is an extraordinary human drama and human experience. What happens in terms of the battle is completely and utterly determined by logistics and very predictable. The second the Soviets cut the supply line, Stalingrad is doomed. Unless the Germans can reopen a logistical supply, they can't do it. So, in other words, there's drama to the battle, but there's also no drama whatsoever. Right? It was never going to go any other way once the Germans do it. So to me, all I see are supply lines in and out. You know, when you look at the battle, people see what they want to see. All I would really care about are the roads in and out. That will determine the course of the battle. Nothing that happens in Stalingrad itself makes any significant difference. Indeed, I would look at the war entirely, if not entirely, but when I think you look at a war, what you want to do is not, the obsession is to look at the front. That's often the way people look at a war. Where is the front line? Okay, there. In fact, we do it now in the Russo-Ukraine war, with the front line were moved 100 yards today. Or it's bizarre, the focus on the front line. What instead I think you should do and look at a war is a series of interconnected transportation links, moving things around, because those are the actual tellers of how power is being generated and how power is being deployed. Now, when you look at that, it becomes a very complex operation, because almost all logistical operations are based on 2 forms of transportation, at least. Some are based on 3 or 4. That you have to go truck, train, and boat. But at least I can't think of any major Second World War logistic operation that isn't based on at least 2 main forms of transportation. So you really need an integrated transport net, an ability to move a large amount of supplies from point A to point B. If you look at the Pacific, which is really quite the extraordinary logistical challenge faced by both the Japanese and the United States, you have thousands and thousands of miles of which you have to cover. The United States, most of the things that end up fighting here in the Pacific are built off this map somewhere there. Right? They're built in the Midwest. So most of the things that you see the United States fighting with are not even built on the West Coast. They're built thousands of miles here. And you have to set up a very sort of intricate supply system to get everything 7, 8, almost halfway around the world, thousands of miles over there. And it involves bringing mostly trains to the ports here, and then you would bring a shipping system often to the Hawaiian Islands, and another shipping system in stages to the forward points. So for the United States, you have this massive logistical capacity. What is important to understand in terms of the war is the Japanese were let down, I would say thankfully, by not looking at logistics as an honorable form of making attacks. The Japanese look at war, you win your glory fighting battles. So what the Japanese never did, they never attacked anything much on the supply line. And the Americans didn't have to deploy a lot of force to protect it. It is a colossal mistake by the Japanese. So it is interesting how you choose to fight a war makes a big difference. If the Japanese had tried to sever these supply lines, and they only try to sever them very late in the war, by which point they can't do it, it would have made a very significant difference in how the war in the Pacific worked out. But the Japanese don't try to it, and instead what they try to do is hold the battles, win the battles on the islands, and they fail. The Americans eventually do the exact opposite. I was talking yesterday about the shipping of oil. The single most important shipping route for Japan is this one here, because this brings the oil from, well, Indonesia today, the Dutch East Indies then, up to Japan itself. So that is the shipping lane the Japanese have to protect if their entire economy is going to function and if their military machine is going to operate. And by 1943, the United States is now starting to sever it here, basically with submarines and aircraft. And by 1944, they shut the whole thing when they take the Philippines. And that basically ends the war in a military way. The Japanese can't move from that point on. The only Japanese forces that can move are the ones down here. They have so much oil, they don't know what to do with them. Now, these Japanese forces are awash with oil. They are probably the most well supplied anywhere. But the main Japanese forces in Japan and China and these islands have no ability to move, right, except by foot. So the Pacific presents really probably the most extreme logistical operation, and it will determine how the Pacific War works out. Far more than any other battles, which shipping lines are open and which shipping lines are not open make a massive difference. In Europe, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail now, maybe because I'm assuming you're a bit more interested in the European War, the really interesting and important interchange is between rail and road. I really hope this isn't boring going to logistics, but this is actually the and this, by the way, is what we are seeing in Ukraine today. The same logistical networks are working in Ukraine as we saw in the Second World War. The number one element you have to have is railways. Why? Because one, you start having in the Second World War super heavy equipment. The First World War, you have some heavy equipment, but not, tanks are still small in number, whatever. In the Second World War, you have masses of heavy equipment. Now, you look at a tank and you think, look, a big heavy thing. It actually can only go on the road for a little bit because it's so heavy. If you have a Tiger tank or a Panther tank, it can go maybe 50 miles on the road. That it will have a breakdown or need servicing or it will eat so much fuel, it will run out of fuel in X number of miles. So the only way to actually deploy these super heavy armored forces and supply them is to bring them by train as closely as possible to the front line. All right? And that goes for everything. That goes for shells. It goes for any military piece of equipment. You don't want to bring it by trucks when you switch it from train to truck until the last possible minute. Because once you're switching it to a truck, you are now going to severely limit how much further you can go forward. Trains can just keep going. As long as you have coal, that train can be chugging away from basically, Brest in the far west of France to almost the gates of Moscow. That train can just go. It can carry whatever you want for as long as you want. All you need is a little coal to keep it going. When it comes to a truck, that's a very different proposition because it constantly needs fuel to carry a much lighter weight. In fact, certain things couldn't go on a truck at all, like a Tiger tank. They simply were too heavy. So you want to have that switch from rail to road for as late as possible. So really, in terms of what the Second World War is, it's a question of where you establish your forward depots, and that will determine how much further forward your armories can go. If you want to look at the invasion of France in 1940, the single greatest break the Germans get is they capture forward French rail lines. And once they get the French rail lines, that means they can keep the French army supplied all the way to, the German army supplied all the way to the coast. The other thing, the other way that works is during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Barbarossa. If you look at Barbarossa, it is basically 3 periods defined completely by logistics. So the Germans make a big advance, then they run out of supplies. And then they have to stop, and they have to stop for weeks while the train lines are rebuilt and the trucks are brought forward. Then they build up and they go again. And then they get to the limit of that supply. Then they have to stop and they have to rebuild the train lines and they have to stick the trucks and they do it. So they do it 3 times. That's why it takes 4 months, 5 months to go from the launch point to the gates of Moscow. All right? If they could have supplied it better, they could have gotten to Moscow much more quickly. There is, in terms of natural, I've tried to do the calculation. Once you leave a depot, a railway, and once you go to trucks for supply, you can only advance between 100 and 200 miles. 200 miles is the absolute limit. And then you are going to have to stop. Because at that point, by the way, your trucks will become inefficient. You'll have to use so much fuel refueling the trucks that you'll need a lot of trucks to fuel the trucks. So you'll be using masses of trucks to fuel the trucks. We know this because we have one example, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. It happened just a little bit south of here, of the most extreme truck resupply of the Second World War. And that's called the Red Ball Express, which the U.S. Army did in 1944 after the breakout from Normandy. So the U.S. Army basically, for those who know the Normandy campaign, it went very differently than expected. Basically, the original assumption between the American and British planners was they would land here and then gradually advance a few miles a day to Paris. So they would go steadily, regularly. Supply wouldn't be a problem because they'd be advancing sort of 5 miles a day. And they did. But in fact, the exact opposite happens. The Germans at first pin them in here, so they make very few advances to begin with. The first months of the Normandy campaign are painfully slow for the British and the Americans, and they're way behind schedule. And then, about August, so 2 months really, there is a German collapse. The Germans basically just run out, and their logistic lines are cut. And the Americans are left with almost an undefended central flanks. There's nothing the Germans can do to stop them. The one thing that's going to stop the Americans is the supplies. So they are trying desperately to find a way to get supplies to their troops as they go forward. What they can't do, I talked a little bit about this yesterday, is they can't use the rail lines because they've destroyed them all. So the United States basically spends the first 6 months of 1944 destroying every rail line it possibly can in France. And then, lo and behold, it does a very good job. And then when it needs the rail lines, they aren't there. They can't rebuild them in just one summer. It's going to take longer to rebuild them. So they're stuck having to rely on trucks. And the United States, being the United States, does have more trucks than anyone else. But they put together this extraordinary logistical operation where they have these sort of bivouac areas and the constant, so you would go truck from there to there, and then you'd have some trucks gaining supplies, some trucks carrying fuel for the trucks, then you'd have depots to go from there to there, and then depots to the forward line. But with the most extraordinary, the roads of France are just basically this in the summer of 1944. It's just lines of trucks the entire way. With the full American industrial potential, they get to there. So they have about 300 and something miles, and then they just stop dead. They cannot go any further, even though the German army is basically still non-existent at that point. The Germans couldn't stop them. They just simply, they cannot keep the trucks going. Forward generals start taking the fuel from the trucks, so the trucks can't get back because they want to move the fuel to their tanks. So generals always forget about logistics too. There's a Patton, buccaneering general. Well, he's also a bit of a logistical disaster because he basically drains the trucks dry to give one load of fuel to his tanks. Then he goes forward, but he's stuck with thousands of unfueled trucks sitting near the front. And that's what happens. So the U.S. Army begins this Red Ball Express. And again, the amount of material that they go through in just 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, it's sobering to think about industrially. That when you think of the jerry can, if you think of the fuel can, which is a really important thing in war. I won't bore you by giving you the history of the jerry can. It's actually an Italian design, but a really efficient Italian design. But the Americans assume the Germans designed it, so they call it the jerry can. No, it's true that they assume it's an Italian design, but the Germans adopt it, and the Americans think it's and the British. Actually, it might have been the British who first called it a jerry can, because the British were more likely to call the Germans the jerry. But it's a very efficient way of carrying, an amount of fuel that a human can carry and supply. When this campaign was over, there were 14 million jerry cans spread across France. 14 million. just lying by the roadside, unaccounted for. They tried to actually find, the U.S. Army said, well, how many jerry cans do we have left? And there were 14 million missing. That's, I don't know, that would have been the steel production of Belgium in a year, you know, if not more. And even, so the whole point about it is logistics determine that. And what happened is the U.S. Army stopped dead there, and it was stopped dead there for months. And all they could do at that point was wait till the railways could reach them. And you know, it determines the stop. Germany, if logistics were not a consideration, Germany's defeated in the late fall of 1944, because there's nothing there to stop it. The thing that saves Germany is logistics. So that's sort of the road to rail, and that's what happens if you don't have rail. Okay, if you don't have rail, that's the most you can do. That's the most extreme. Now, I talk a little bit about direct air logistics because people discuss that, and it is talked about in Stalingrad. It's a myth. It doesn't really work, okay, because it's so hard to keep the planes in the air, and planes cannot carry a lot of weight. So anyone talks in the Second World War of doing long time or sort of heavy lift in air logistics, it's very, very difficult to do. That, you know, a C-4, the largest kind of cargo plane, could carry efficiently about what a pretty simple Packard truck could carry. But again, a C-4 costs thousands, many, many times more to build and to maintain. So when it comes to air things, it almost always fails. The Germans tried to do it at Stalingrad, but the aircraft wastage is simply too high. And plus, they can't efficiently get supplies in and out. The U.S. did it a few times, but not for that long. So they do it mostly in the Pacific theater, where you have a long distance between islands, and they can't send ships everywhere, so they would do air supply in the Pacific. But again, they only do it a few times, and they only do it for limited periods. So logistics, if they are going to really work in the Second World War, it's train, it's truck, or it's ship. All right? That's the way you get things and you move things. And large armies are the road rail. So that's sort of the basic connection there. Now, I've been giving you really deployment logistics, what I would call deployment logistics. And that is, I think, how most people look at logistics, is sort of deploying out to the armed forces. However, I think there's a whole understanding, an issue of what I'm calling there strategic or pre-production logistics. And these are, you could argue, just as, or perhaps even more important than deployment logistics, because basically deployment logistics come out of this. And these are the ones that go into the whole making part of a military force. Not deploying it, but how you create it. And the Second World War has an enormous amount of logistical fights, logistical logistical contests in the pre-production phase. And again, it's hugely influential. One would say, actually, it's in European terms, it determines how the 1941 to 1943. It's basically about trying to prevent or protect the flow of raw materials to your factories and food to your population. And really, the one that I'm going to talk about very briefly, I apologize I don't have a map, is the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic is the most efficient campaign the Germans ever fight. Why is it the most efficient campaign? Because for about 10% of their production, they tie down and destroy far more than that of Allied production. Because what they're doing is the Allies have to respond to it, because if the Allies lose the Battle of the Atlantic, Britain ceases to be a power. Pre-production logistics are so important to Britain that if the Germans can sever trade across the Atlantic, they don't just, create a problem for Britain, they end Britain as a power. What does that mean? Well, one basic way, Britain has too many people to feed itself. That if you look at Britain, why Britain in the Industrial Revolution becomes Britain is because they could start shipping in food from all over the world. All right, so Britain goes from, I think England has about 7 million people in 1800 to 45 million people in 1900. British food production goes up by 2 or 3 times. So the population goes up by 8 or 9 times. The food production goes up by 2 or 3. So the reason Britain can actually be Britain is that it ships food from all over the world, primarily North America and South America, but also it had shipped it in from parts of Europe. So Britain cannot function without food. If Britain is ever cut off, you couldn't reduce the caloric intake enough. Even with the most stringent rationing, you would have mass starvation, probably 2 to 3 months, and you would have riots on the street, you would have uprisings. And that's what the Battle of Atlanta, and by the way, Britain also doesn't have a lot of raw materials. It has coal, has a ton of coal, had some iron ores, but a lot of those are actually mined out by the Second World War, so their early iron ore deposits are gone. Their bauxite comes entirely, back to bauxite, that comes almost entirely from Jamaica. So they're shipping bauxite across the Atlantic. They build a ton of aircraft, but that's only because they can ship it across. So if any time in the Second World War, during the Battle of the Atlantic, German submarines are able to close the Atlantic, Britain actually ceases to be a power. It's not just a bad battle loss. It's a catastrophic economic collapse that would set in. The population would starve and all the factories would shut. And that's the only way you can look at the Battle of the Atlantic being, I would argue, far more important, say, than something like the Battle of Stalingrad. It's bad that the Germans lose the Sixth Army, but it doesn't affect Germany's ability to produce. Nothing in Stalingrad is of economic value to the Germans. German factories don't rely on anything from that region. It doesn't supply more workers to the Germans. It doesn't supply any food. It's a military loss at the front. For the British to lose the Battle of the Atlantic is a catastrophic systemic loss throughout. And that's why I would say the difference between battles and actually what matters, a logistic campaign versus that. So without the ability to move goods on the ocean surface, Britain's factories would cease to operate and its population would starve. So I'll come up with 3 basic conclusions of logistics and World War II. And actually, I think these are unarguable. If you lose the logistics fight, you lose the campaign. I've tried to think of any campaign where someone someone lost the logistics fight and triumphed, and there isn't. The second you lose the logistics campaign, the ultimate result is known. Might take longer, it might take a few weeks, in a few cases it might take a few months. But the result is undeniable. The side that has cut the logistics flow or even severely hampered it is going to win that engagement. So control of logistics determines battles in the Second World War and campaigns, not generalship or anything like that. Not what happens at the battles. It is the control of the flow of goods to the battle area that determines. It's always more effective and efficient to destroy logistics than to do direct attacks. So if you set up your militaries in such a way that your military is mostly something to directly attack the military of the other side, maybe that's all well and good, I don't know, but that is far less effective. The far more effective way to militarily get what you want in a campaign is not to bludgeon your head against the well-defended enemy. The best way to do it is to go over them, behind them, around them, and weaken them, and then you can basically almost make them helpless. So depending on how you wish to fight a campaign, you can make it either much harder or much easier on yourself. And ultimately, why is that? And I was trying to come up with a calculation. Maybe I try to calculate things too much. But actually, a weapon destroyed before battle, that you can destroy before battle, is at least of double value. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I make 1,000 aircraft, but I can only get 500 in battle, that means I've made 500 aircraft that will never do anything for me. So that side that has destroyed that aircraft is one, kept it from coming and never has to fight it. That's what I mean by a doubled valued kind of weapon. And because we don't see those weapons operated in battle, we sometimes forget about them. But the fact that they never reach the battle means that their destruction is at least of double value. All right, because it's never, the worst way to destroy a weapon is to have it be destroyed in the process of killing you or fighting you, because then you have to destroy things on the battlefield to get it. It's far more effective to keep it from reaching the battlefield. This also means you freed up to attack the smaller amount that's there. So in many ways, 2 times doesn't do it justice. It could be actually a geometric. You know, if you keep half the things from getting there, it's probably by a factor of 4 the way you are influencing your battle. So those, I would say, are sort of 3 basic conclusions on logistics in World War II. Now, logistics and deployment today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Russo-Ukraine war, which has many of the same instances that we see. Well, I think we can say the Russo-Ukraine war is being determined by a lot of the issues of logistical flow. And the best way forward, indeed, for Ukraine would be to be able to fight a logistic war that's partly being hampered in. Now, it is not one in terms of deployment where the sea matters enormously when it comes to the pre-production logistics, the shipping of grain. But for most sides in this war, the key thing to get soldiers to the front is this combination of rail and truck, or indeed car or van. The amount of different supply options once you leave the railhead is really quite extraordinary, from 4x4s to other means of transport, but the basic transport links are the same as the Second World War. You have rail lines to bring things as close as you can safely to the front, and then you bring them on ships, on some kind of a transport, a truck, from that point to the soldiers in the front line. All right, so that's the basic thing. It's much harder to do than people expected, and indeed now, I don't want to guess, but we might have reached the stage where what we are seeing is a simple logistical inability of either side to advance more than a human can walk, because there's no way to have trucks survive. What we have seen in the last 18 months is almost no advances. And I know, yes, you hear about places, Bakhmut, Advika, Robotyne. The map shifting in these areas is about 10 miles. You know, that's what we've had shifting on the line. 15 kilometers is about where the line has shifted in different ways at most. That amount of shifting is really strategically insignificant. And it's because we simply don't know whether supplies can survive going forward in this war. Both sides can get them relatively close to the front on the trains, though by relatively close, probably 30 or 40 miles from the front before they start getting, into real problematic area. But once they get off the train, it's very hard to bring them forward. And my guess is it's going to become increasingly more difficult as the airs get full of drones. Again, the transparency of this battlefield is going to make it extremely difficult. Now, this was also shown earlier in the war. I'm going to bring up that picture. That might be one. By the way, you could never have this now, and that was only 2 years ago. This would never occur now. It couldn't occur. This was the original Russian full-scale invasion, which was a mass deployment. Those are all supply trucks. Those are no tanks or armored personnel carriers, or, those are not fighting vehicles. That was a 40-mile column of supply trucks. And that was the logistical column the Russians had to use to send the force to try and take Kyiv. It was that just went on and on and on and on and on down the road, and it was then stopped dead. And it led to extraordinary paralysis. I mean, it shows just how logistics determined to this day how the war was going to go on. The Russians didn't have control over the Ukrainian rail network, so they couldn't put anything on a railway, which is how the Russians do their logistics. They had to bring everything by truck, so they literally scraped Russia dry, created this huge military force of trucks, sent it down the road, and then it stopped dead. All right. It ended up being a catastrophic logistical failure. Kyiv was saved by the fact that it was actually logistically impossible to take it. I don't actually believe the Hostomel. We were talking about the Hostomel thing. They simply cannot supply the army because the lift that they need to go is too far. It's too far from the rail lines, that they don't have the ability to keep the supply going. And now, the amazing thing is we saw all of this. This was a satellite shot during the opening of the invasion. They were just simply sitting out there on the road. You couldn't do this now because every one of those trucks would be hit by UAVs. They'd simply be seen and they would be destroyed, boom, 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 in succession. And if you can't do that kind of line, then really how far can you advance? You know, how far can you go forward if you cannot mass? It's not just massing trucks, it's massing tanks, it's massing trucks that lead the thing. So I do wonder whether we're in a period that we are going to have a very nasty attritional war because it's going to be very hard for either side to move forward. One side will have to be so weak that it cannot resist before you're going to be able to have truck-led advances. That's why when people say, oh, the Russians might make another attempt at Kyiv, that is only happening if the Ukrainians are actually about to give up. There's no way the Russians are getting to Kyiv if the Ukrainians can give any resistance at all, because the Russians don't have the truck lift. They simply can't do it. And that basic relationship goes forward. Now, on the other hand, the Ukrainians have also an extraordinary logistic opportunity, and the Russians have a real problem in the case of Crimea. Crimea is, this is why American aid is shaped. It's fascinating that how much of this war and how much of the aid Ukraine has been given has come down to Crimea. And I'll talk about the US perception in a little bit, but from a logistical point of view, Crimea is a massive problem for the Russians. You could actually say the war is ultimately a struggle over the fate of Crimea, logistically. Now, what is the problem? Well, there are only 3 ways to get into Crimea. All right? There's the Kerch Bridge, which has been built from Russia into Crimea itself. There are the naval bases of Sevastopol and Nikopol. I'm sorry if I butcher the pronunciation. And then there's the land bridge from sort of mainland Ukraine in. If the Ukrainians have already shut down basically the seaports, so it is very hard for the Russians to get any amount of material into Crimea through the ports, all right, because it's simply too dangerous. They've lost too much shipping. So indeed, the Black Sea Fleet has been taken mostly out of Crimea. Sevastopol was its home base. It is now based in Russia itself. So that part is now in some ways gone as a logistical concern. And that means Russia really only has 2 ways to get things in, the Kerch Bridge and through Ukraine properly. That's why the Kerch Bridge is so important. Actually, if the Kerch Bridge is ever severed, probably Crimea can't be held. All right? Crimea needs a ton, Crimea is one of those things, we talk about Britain needing food. Crimea can't function without water. Crimea has real serious water issues. For much of the year, you can have drought in Crimea. So if you can't have ways to actually bring in water and ensure supplies, Crimea becomes, I don't want to say uninhabitable, but it becomes uninhabitable for a large population. We humans live in much larger populations in places than we should be. And the only way we live in such large numbers in certain places is because we can bring things in logistically. All right, if we went to basically living in an area which can be supported only by the local resources, the human population would decline vastly and quickly. All right, so you have to be able to bring things in. So Crimea is in many ways, if the Ukrainians have certain issues with logistics, then the Russians have massive issues of logistics. And indeed, in many ways, as I'm going to talk about at the end of today, the Crimean logistical question could be the single most important one in the war. It is the one, by the way, which most obsesses Washington, and you could say Germany, though in ways you might be surprised. So there's that. I'll talk a little bit about logistics and the production phase of the war today, because I think logistics is affecting everything. And in many ways, this part of it is more important than anyone ever imagined. I think the shocking failure of understanding war going into February 24th, 2022, was the short war idea, and that everyone had enough, or the Russians had enough, to fight the war. You know, there was almost no discussion of sustainment and logistics. You know, what happens if the Russians don't win in the first few weeks? That was considered so outlandish that no one bothered to say, you know, what actually would be the situation if it occurred. Well, we are now in a very weird phase in this war. And what do I mean by that? Both sides, particularly the Russians, are severely weaker than they were in February 2022. That might sound odd because, you know, the armies are there and they're fighting and they're killing. But actually, both sides are, in some ways, having more difficulty sourcing supplies than they did. Because they've used up far more than they can produce. If you want one example of this, the most important might be artillery shells. And again, I'm sure you're not too excited about artillery shell production. But basically, Russia had a massive store of artillery shells. It had the world's largest supply of artillery shells going into the war, which was considered far more than Russia could ever possibly need. Indeed, it was said that, you know, under wartime conditions, the Russian shell capacity could be 8 years of full fighting. Well, it's almost all gone now. All right? And Russia is on a declining shell. That's why they're going to North Korea and Iran and everywhere else, because they're on a declining shell path. In 2022, the amount of shells they fired is truly eye-watering. The best estimates are they fired about 11 million shells, all right, large artillery shells. They were firing upwards of 60,000 a day at the high point in 2022. All right, but they went through 11 million shells in that 1 year of firing. The Ukrainians probably also destroyed a few million in Russian depots. I haven't had time to talk about depot attacks. If you want to in the question period, we can discuss depot attacks. But logistically, the Ukrainians had a very positive period for them in the summer of 2022 when they had an American HIMARS system arrive. And basically, the Russian depots were all within range of this new system. And for 2 months, the Ukrainians basically devastated all Russian depots. Now all Russian depots are 1 mile beyond HIMARS range. You can see them on a map. They have basically moved them to just outside where a HIMARS can reach them to save them. And the Ukrainians can't get to them now unless they can get to them with drones. But the Ukrainians basically destroyed a series of very large Russian ammunition depots. So maybe the destruction, you know, the use and destruction of shells for the Russians could have been upwards of 14 million. Combined in 2022. Well, in 2023, they fired 7 to 8 million. So you had a significant reduction in what they could muster. All right? And from what we know now, they are down to 10,000 a day, which is they're on a pace to fire 3 million. All right? And that's by trying to basically get as many shells as they can. Now, they're still firing a lot more than the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians have basically lost access to American shells, which they never expected. But the trajectory of production is actually not going well in this war. Usually when a war, everyone ramps up and they start building far more than they're using. But still, with certain things, these sides are using far more than they're building. And that means it's logistically even more important to try and source these shells. So we are now on the worldwide market. We are in a sort of logistics race between Russia and Ukraine to find shells wherever they can. That's why the North Korean link has been very valuable for Russia. It's amazing how people are finding shells wherever. They might have sourced up to 3 million shells from North Korea. Originally, people thought, oh, they'll get 250,000 or 300,000. The best estimates now are they have gotten 3 million shells. And what they're paying for that is unimaginable. But they're basically paying 2 or 3 times market rates. The Czechs are leading this effort to get 800,000 shells for Ukraine. But they're also paying 2 or 3 times the sort of going cost before the war for a shell. And that's to get 800,000. And And they're sourcing it from places as different as Pakistan and South Korea. So the world is basically being stripped of shells by these two sides. And neither one, Ukraine is starting to make some of its own shells. It's still going to be far below usage. And Russia, even putting great efforts into it, is probably going to make 2 million shells this year. But that's what I mean about it's a decreasing kind of thing. And whichever side can source more shells going forward, you might say will have a massive advantage in this war. It's one of the kinds of equipment usages that we'll talk about it. And that, that you'll see 2024, this year, will be determined, I think, whether we can get enough shells to Ukraine, because right now the Ukrainians have very few shells because of the cutoff of U.S. aid. January and February were some of the toughest months of the entire war. In certain days, the Ukrainians had on the entire front fewer than 1,000 shells. So you would have whole brigades that would get their daily allowance. I was actually talking to a Ukrainian officer the other day, and he said a good friend of his commands a brigade in one of the hottest combat zones, and in January, February, certain days he would get 6 shells. 6. And that would be all they would have because basically the cupboards were dry. So these 800,000 that the Czechs are sourcing will make a massive difference if they can get there. Again, it will be partly a case of trying to ship them in and get them in there. It's now, they've been found, they've been located, prices have been agreed. Now it's actually getting them there. And that's a bigger logistical operation. And it could very much determine the war. But there's also pre-deployment. So if this is the sort of the deployment and procurement phase of logistics with shells, and by the way, we can talk about other military munitions, the pre-deployment phase is far more important than people thought before the war. That this is what I mean, this movement of raw materials, supplies, food, everything was not considered important because the war was never going to last so long and because it was going to be so one-decided. And actually the war, I wouldn't have said Ukraine would lose the war if the Black Sea had been closed, but the Ukrainian economy would be in terrible shape right now. Worse shape than it is if the Russians had done what everyone assumed they would do, which is to keep the Black Sea shut, because Ukraine is an enormous food producer. It makes so much of its money by the buying of grain. So the entire domestic economy during this war, in terms of its own ability to produce money, comes down to the Ukrainian ability to ship food. All right, that's its big source of foreign capital. And the assumption, and early in the war, was that the Ukrainians would never get any food out. The Russians would just shut off the Black Sea. And you can see, by the way, politically, how Ukraine would have been a bind. Just sending tiny little bits of grain through Poland now are causing. It's politically far more difficult to send, and the amount of grain that's being sent through Poland is tiny. This is not massive amounts of grain compared to what they're loading up in Odessa in full bulk liners. So the Ukrainian ability to open Odessa has really provided the domestic economy with a source of its own income. Otherwise, Ukraine would be entirely living on financial handouts. So basically, Europe and the United States, the World Bank, would be having to bankroll the entire, well, they are bankrolling significant amounts of the war, but the Ukrainians also have some capital which gives them some freedom. And the capital the Ukrainians have, a lot of it is coming on this food shipment. All right, so it provides the Ukrainians some autonomy in their war economy, the fact that you have been able to do that. And the Ukrainians are now, I talked about this later yesterday in terms of Airpower, also trying to run their own pre-production campaign to damage Russian income. And they're trying to damage Russian income by damaging Russian oil refineries. It might be that this is actually a very different pre-production war, logistics war than the Second World War. In the Second World War, it wasn't about damaging money so much, it was about damaging raw material and food. But because the buying of things from outside of the countries is so important in this war, that actually damaging the money might be the way to do it. If you can reduce capital flows, you can reduce the ability of things that could be that people can buy. Again, overall, it shows the great potential benefits of winning this kind of struggle, but the kicker is it's really, really hard to do. I think when it comes to attacking logistics in the pre-production stage, it is extraordinarily effective, but it's extraordinarily difficult, and usually it fails, be it the German attempt to sever the North Atlantic, or indeed the Russian attempt to shut the Ukrainians out of Odessa. And the Ukrainians are trying to do something very difficult in shutting Russian refineries down. It's because the maintenance of these systems are so valuable that usually one side will do almost anything it can to keep them going. So it's useful in some ways and distracting, but it's very hard to do. And I'm not sure that either side understands or has deployed the kind of force needed to win a pre-production logistics campaign. So that is something to consider. The last point I want to talk about tonight is how logistics, and this is talking about Crimea, but also how the war has been fought and how the United States has gone to a great length to make Ukraine fight a specific war, which I would say is a really stupid war. The United States is making Ukraine fight a non-logistics war. If you want me to put it in a nutshell, and I'll explain what I mean by that. That I've tried to establish in this lecture that actually logistics is attacking logistics and limiting logistics is by far the most efficient way to fight a war. It saves your own side a huge amount in terms of lost lives and lost equipment. It makes wars end more quickly. It makes campaigns end more quickly because of this factor of double, triple valuing weapons. The worst way you can fight a war is not to attack logistics, but just to attack your enemy directly all the time. That's what the Japanese did in the Second World War. It's usually one that works out very, very badly. However, when we look at the U.S., we see the U.S. has been trying to make Ukraine basically fight like the Japanese in the Second World War, not to fight like the United States fights. So they're making Ukraine fight a war that the United States would never fight itself. This is because the United States is, and I've talked about this in other lectures, it is terribly worried about escalation, and that is that things might get so bad for Russia that Putin would go nuclear, or even, and just as scary, things might get so bad that Russia would collapse. So the United States is fighting this war to try and, in its mind, maintain stability. And stability means keeping Russia functioning. All right? And so what they have done is basically given Ukraine weapons of very limited range. I've never seen a war. It's basically saying to Ukraine, we'll give you everything we can as long as it fires for no more than 25 to 30 miles. And that's really what they've been doing. They've been significantly limiting, so, or even 40 miles with the HIMARS. So they've been very, very specific with what the United States has given Ukraine. They have been giving Ukraine weapons for limited battlefield engagement, to force Ukraine. These are weapons to attack the Russian lines directly. They are not to attack Russians logistically. You could see that by the sort of the things that they have just dragged their heels on. What has the United States not dragged its heels on, and what has it dragged its heels on? It didn't drag its heels on HIMARS or 155 millimeter artillery. It even in the end didn't drag its heels too much on Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. These had all started shipping into 2023. However, what has it still not delivered, what allowed, they're going to come soon, F-16s. They held off on F-16s as long as possible, and they're still really delaying it to this day. All right, now F-16s are not going to be flying till this summer. They could have been flying well over a year ago, but the U.S. has been making that impossible, and they, to this day, will not give Ukraine ATACMS. There's some talk that they might. ATACMS is an artillery for HIMARS. I do apologize for talking about all these military systems, but basically ATACMS are fired from a HIMARS, and they can fire for 300 kilometers. All right, that's why. Is it air power? Is it not air power? Is it a missile? It becomes at a point where our discussion of what is air power and what is not air power. HIMARS is considered an artillery system, but if you can fire something 300 kilometers, have you ceased to be an artillery system and become a vehicle for air power? It's clear why the United States is dragging its heel on F-16 and ATACMS. It's because they have decided that Crimea is an escalation Russian collapse issue. And I think that's entirely the way they look at it, that the American vision is if we give Ukraine ATACMS and the Germans follow up with Tauruses, actually the Russian ability to logistically control Crimea instantly becomes under threat. Much more than the front line, the ability to hold Crimea is a problem for the Russians. And it does, in fact, the more troops they have in Crimea, the harder it is to hold because they can't supply them. That's how logistics work. So if you give the ability to sever the roads in and out of Crimea, and you could do that with ATACMS and Tauruses, then actually Crimea itself might be untenable for the Russians. They cannot supply it. They sent the short-range ATACMS. They could only attack in the mainland. They have not sent a single system that can attack into Crimea. The only people who have are the British and the French, the Storm Shadows and the Scalps. And you might say, unlike, unfortunately for us, the British and the French don't make as good things as the Germans or the Americans. They don't have the kind of explosive warheads on the Storm Shadows and the Scalps to take out the Kerch Bridge, and plus the British and the French don't have enough of them. So but you can see what the range has done with those. It's basically helped drive the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol. That's been done by Storm Shadows and Scalps as much as sea drones, is that they've made Sevastopol uninhabitable for the Russians by destroying the infrastructure. So, but the United States and the Germans have not. They've been very clear on what they've been giving, and they've not crossed that range line. They've not given anything that can attack into Crimea. And I think it's made it's basically determined the course of the war. It forced Ukraine to do the direct counteroffensive this summer, which from now, just defensive technology to the point is direct attacks aren't going to work in this war. They're only going to work if the other side is so weak. So really, if this war is going to be determined and either side is going to go forward, it will be if one side or the other can impose itself on the logistics of the other. It will be like that. So that will be how the war will be decided going forward. On that very cheerful note, I will call an end to the logistics talk, and we can have a discussion and questions, or I don't know if anyone has logistics questions, but I'm happy to go back and
So since this is podcasted, if we want to have the sound on the recording, you need to use the microphone. So, anyone, questions? Yep.
So you talked about the West sending F-16s to Ukraine. So my question is, would it make a really big difference in the whole front, or not?
Well, they'll make less of a difference than they would have made a year ago. It's interesting, by delaying, you allow sort of preparatory moves to go in. They will make a significant difference, but by the time they arrive, the real big difference they're going to make is probably defensive and helping the Ukrainians from being attacked. I was discussing this with a Ukrainian officer. One of the big issues, this is a war where both sides are trying to come up with ranged systems to attack from a distance, because the closer you attack, the far more dangerous it is. And I've talked about these in other lectures, but one of the big Russian successes in the ranged war is glide bombs. And that they weren't used really in 2023 until very late, but they're now glide bombs being used throughout. And what a glide bomb is, it is an incredibly heavy bomb. The weight of these bombs is enormous. They, in some ways, would be close to a Hiroshima kind of explosion. They're enormously heavy. And they can now go, the furthest you can release them is about 60 miles, but ideally you want to release them about 40 miles away. And they're so explosive, they don't have to be accurate. I mean, they basically just level a grid. You just say, grid map, I'm going to send this enormous glide bomb in. What the Ukrainians have done is force them outside of Patriot range. So there's the Patriot anti-aircraft system, and that is brilliant to 40 miles. And so these bombs are not being dropped within 40 miles because the Ukrainians shot down a number of planes dropping these glide bombs. They're now dropping them from 45 miles, 50, somewhere out of that range, so they can't be engaged by the Patriots. But they're still dropping them because, and because they don't have to be that accurate, they can be really difficult. What the F-16s can do is basically, in the Ukrainian mind, do things like end the glide bomb threat. And by the way, the Ukrainians are about to have glide bombs, so that they will be able to launch their glide bombs with F-16s, because the F-16s are better aircraft, closer. So it will make a significant incremental difference in the war. It will help Ukraine basically drive Russian fixed-wing aircraft farther back and allow Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft to get closer. But we're only talking 60 F-16s, so we have to be somewhat reasonable on what we expect from these aircraft. And some of them will get shot down. That they will get shot. I remember people talking about, Leopard 2s and Abrams tanks are going to go, and they were destroyed in the first day in action, a large number of Leopard 2s. This is a really destructive war. And so I think that F-16s will be helpful for Ukraine. They will save Ukrainian lives. So they will save soldiers' lives on the front. They will drive Russian air power out. Their ability to attack Russian logistics will come to whether they are equipped with the range systems that they can use on Russian logistics. But the United States is so desperate not to give Ukraine that range that they might limit it.
You said that Crimea could not sustain itself without water.
Yep.
But in 2014, Ukraine has cut water supply to Crimea, and it was before the construction of the Crimean Bridge. So
they had Sevastopol. I mean, there was both a smaller Russian population there, and they had Sevastopol. So they had enough to keep it going.
So they shipped the water through Sevastopol.
Well, they were able to bring enough. I don't know the exact process, but they were able to get enough water into Crimea to keep it going. If you get rid of the bridge and you get rid of the naval bases, now you could have a very wet year too. So maybe the water crunch won't happen right away because the weather is not always predictable. And Crimea has, and I am not a water expert, and if anyone is, please correct me, but Crimea uses a lot of rainwater, collected rainwater becomes the source because it doesn't have large aquifers to service it. So you might have a very wet year, and it will be able to hold. But water becomes one of the things. It gets most of its water from Ukraine. From Ukraine proper is where it's getting its water, coming out of the Dnipro River basin. So water could become a massive issue.
And I have a second question.
Sure.
You said that it was very difficult for the trucks to go to the front line.
Yeah.
It was very dangerous. But we saw videos of Zelensky not long ago at Avdiivka.
Yeah.
So was it a
one truck's okay. One van zipping down a road. But you're not going to support a large army advance with a few vans.
But was it very, very dangerous for Zelensky to take such
It was certainly
risks?
a risk to take. I mean, they probably sent him in a small vehicle. They weren't going to send him in a big, noticeable vehicle. But it's one of those things when I'm trying to get through, it's the amount of material you have to. It doesn't matter if you can get 1, 2, 3, or 100 trucks in. You need to get hundreds and hundreds of trucks every day up and down the road. So it's different than thinking I can get a truck in. The Japanese could occasionally get an oil tanker up to Japan in 1945, but one tanker out of 100. So it's more about you have to have the ability to have the constant supply. Because again, an army in the field, if it doesn't get constant supply, is very vulnerable. What happens if it does run out of fuel? An army that has run out of fuel is in very dangerous position if it can't maneuver. So you have to have guaranteed supply going forward. And that we have not seen the ability of either side to maintain that kind of lift going forward. Now, we've not seen the opportunity. It might be because defensive firepower has been so strong. No one's had the opportunity to do it. The The Ukrainians had one example in Kharkiv in September of 2022 when they liberated a lot of Kharkiv. And from what we can tell, they did it because there were hardly any Russian troops there. So they actually drove as far as they could until they ran out of fuel. And then that was where the front line was where the Ukrainians were stopped by the fact that they couldn't get any fuel forward. But that's only because they had no opposition, or very little opposition from the Russians. You don't have to talk about it if there's no more questions about logistics. Oh, there is one more, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't fact check this, but I read somewhere that that Russia was moving towards producing around 3 million shells per year,
Yeah.
which is much more than the US plus Europe can produce collectively. Doesn't that mean that once all the shells are depleted in the rest of the world, since you're saying that they're basically, the world is being emptied of its shells by the war, doesn't that mean that on the long term, unless the production is closed down in Russia, there's a big problem?
Russia can, I mean, the upper estimates are 2.5 million for 2024. But there's a mix of that. How many of that is 152 millimeter, which is the key shell, is perhaps not as much as the lower caliber shells. Ukraine doesn't need one for one. Because, I mean, this is one thing where the benefits of NATO standard weapons are better. They're more accurate. So if Ukraine can even be 1 to 2 with artillery fire, it could probably do more damage statistically if it could keep that rate of fire up, because Western weapons are considerably more accurate going forward. So it can't do what it's doing now, which is about 10 to 1. Yeah, the average, this is averages, and we have to be careful because it's not been proven. The Russians are firing about 10,000 shells a day. That's a figure that I've seen repeated. The Ukrainians are lucky to get 1,000. So that's the present balance. Now, if the Czechs can source 800,000, well, then they can actually fire 5,000 shells a day for 160 days. That's pretty good. That could keep the Ukrainians in business for 160 days at half the Russian rate. But even, that's the thing is, even with the Russians making 2.5 million shells, again, the collapse in fire from 2022 where they fired 11 million shells, we're still talking about, and last year 7 million was what they fired probably till October, so maybe they fired 8 or 9 by the end of the year, I don't know. We're on a downward trajectory, and eventually they'll only be able to fire the 2 to 3 million they make every year, which is a considerably smaller number than they're firing now.
Then what explains the huge difficulties in increasing production capacities? If we see what happened in Britain in 1940, 1941, what happened in the US, producing shells is hugely lucrative. I think Rheinmetall made 8 billion in profits and is now promising that in 5 years' time it will double its production capacity. How is this possible? If you can make so much money out of it, why would it take 5 full years to double capacity? Couldn't you do this in 5 months if there's such gains to be made?
Well, in the Russian case, it's because they don't have the physical plant to do it. I mean, they'd have to import a lot of Western technology to make the shells. It's one area where the sanctions could be having some difference, is the sanctions are making the assembly of new production, shell production, more difficult for the Russians than it could be. Certainly, yes, Rheinmetall could make shells, and what the Western producers go, we're not going to sign a contract for increased production for 2 years because we have to sink so much capital into production costs that we need 10-year contracts. The only way we can make our money back is to have a 10-year contract because it will cost us so much money to build the physical plant to do it. And that's a lot of the haggling that's going on within the EU now, is how long the production contracts will last for the artillery shells. And that's a lot of what they're fighting over and how long the guarantees will be. But certainly Europe as a whole should be able to build, it simply has the money and technology to make more shells. Then it's about sourcing the metals for the casings and things like, I mean, nitrocellulose. You need there's certain commodities you need. If you want to make money in the world now, try to corner the nitrocellulose market because that's actually vital for propellants. to make the shells work. But so you have to assemble all these things. But Europe should be able to do it more than Russia going forward. It's a question of commitment.
So Europe should be able to do this alone,
Yes.
even if the United States stops totally providing shells and other military technology.
Yes, it
to
will
Ukraine.
probably, if Europe on its own, we're talking about by the end of 2025. I mean, I think we have to be very clear. We're talking 2 years from now. But it could certainly make enough to keep Ukraine in the fight until that point. And that's why things like the Czech initiative are very high. Well, there's also stories being not told in this war, and we don't know, because these states are being very quiet. There are certain states who are trumpeting everything they give to Ukraine as if they are, the most amazing saints handing over communion wafers. But there are certain states in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe that are quietly laying down logistical production facilities. The Finns. The Finns are actually some of the largest shell producers now in Europe. We don't know, because the Finns have always worried about fighting the Russians. So, and they had their own standard weapons. So the Finns are investing. Now, they're never going to make as much as Russia. But, if they could make 200,000 a year, one country, and that they could then give to Ukraine. That's the way it's probably going to be, is that the states that are desperate to see Russia defeated are making some investments in their armaments industries. And it might be that, we're focused on the west of Europe, and other states are doing a bit more than we understand. And the Danes, by the way, have given the Ukrainians their entire artillery infrastructure. There's not a single gun left in the Danish army, the artillery piece. They've all been handed over, including the stocks, to Ukraine. What's that? Yeah, Estonia has done that. I mean, and the Baltics are making some ammunition now. Yeah. The Czechs are helping hugely. So the Poles are what's that? Yeah.
And what about the French? Is Emmanuel Macron's newfound combativeness in any way matched by industrial projects to increase production? And they have a huge military industry. Is something happening there, or is it just words?
The direct aid that they've given is not that high, though they've given quite a lot through the EU. I mean, if you add what the French contributions have been through the EU to French direct contributions, they're actually not that far behind the British at that point. It's just most of it has been channeled through the EU. Macron says we're doing things we can't tell you. Okay. I don't know what those are. But Macron is saying we are doing more than you understand we're doing more than we can tell you. So I have no idea what they're doing.
Can we expect an industrial rebound for the armaments production in the Liège region? Do you think something is happening there?
Yeah. I don't. You can tell me what's going on here. Whether I mean, Belgium used to be one of the largest arms producers in the world in the early 20th century, but I don't know if anything is being. Is that how it works? It's property of the Walloon. Ah. Okay.
Christian, do you have any information on what's happening in Belgian armaments industry?
So we won't know the story. I mean, again, when the stories come out at the end of this war, it's going to be wild about how shells were procured. Like South Korea, I mean, I can say this because we don't know exactly, but there are rumors going out. South Korea at first wouldn't. South Koreans have a lot of shells because they've basically had North Korea over the border. And they have a very highly developed arms industry because they have North Korea right over the border. So the South Koreans have a military-industrial complex that in some ways outstrips any single nation in Europe. That they have been producing for a major mass war for decades. To begin with, they were very, very worried about aiding Ukraine. They wanted to aid Ukraine, but they didn't want South Korean shells to be fired and Russians picking up South Korean shells. So one of the rumors is that they basically made a massive transfer of shells to America, and that's why America transferred all the shells to Ukraine, because a lot of the American donation was made up by South Koreans. So there's been a lot of funkiness going on shells. Now the South Koreans, I think, because the North Koreans are sending so many shells to the Russians, the South Koreans are losing their inhibitions because they actually see North Korea probably getting a huge amount of money from Russia, and they're pretty angry that the North Korean regime is going to be supported like this. So they seem to be losing some inhibitions. We don't know, but I assume a lot of the Czech purchase has South Korean shells in it. We won't know those figures till after the war, but the South Koreans have a huge supply. And so you find that they're going around armies that had either old, because the Ukrainians have a mixed artillery force now, and the standard Soviet era and now Russian artillery large piece is 152 millimeter, and NATO has 155 millimeter, and they're not, and those 3 millimeters make all the difference. You got to have both ammunition to fire them differently, but a lot of countries had Soviet era ammunition. That's like they were going to India and Pakistan to get the Soviet era stuff. And a lot of stuff, countries like South Korea have the NATO standard. So they're out, there's buyers all around the world now.
But India is supplying Russia, right?
Both. Well, probably both.
Both.
I mean, again, I don't know. I have no idea what the Indians are doing. However, this might be, again, I could be making this up, so don't quote me. You know who's got a very good defense relationship with India now is France. The Indians have been terribly disappointed with the performance of Russian weapons. The Indian army was basically Russian in its outlook, completely stocked with Russian weapons, and they were one of those who were about to say, see, the Russians are going to steamroller, we have this great stuff. It didn't happen. So the Indians have very quietly canceled a lot of their contracts with Russian arms suppliers. And also, by the way, the Russians have had to not send some certain things because they need it for Ukraine. So the defense relationships between India and Russia are not nearly as close as they used to be. The story is that the French are filling that in. Maybe Macron is talking about sourcing 152 millimeter shells from, I literally don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised after this war if we hear the most wild stories of this production logistics war as people are scouring the world to find shells anywhere they can. So, but France is doing very well out of it, supposedly the Indian defense relationship now.
So thank you very much. Tomorrow will be
the future of war.
The future of war.
Well, the questions we need to think about going forward in the war.
Thank you very much. We meet again tomorrow in the same room.